And resentment's always had that. There's a guy I've come to love, is Jerry. He came to me, he's 23 years sober, 23 years without a drink with the benefit of step none. And to say that Jerry was a little brisk was an understatement. I mean, he was an uptight guy. I mean, he was uptight. And I got him started on a 4-step. And I said, you got to make a list of your resentments. And he's an ex-Navy chief, a real macho kind. He said, I don't have any resentments. Nobody gets to me. I just let that stuff roll off me like water off a duck's back. Well, this is the most judgmental, resentful guy I know, right? But he believes that. He believes he's delusional. So I said, you don't have any resentments? Nah, I don't have no resentments. I said, well, Jerry, in your case, we're going to do something a little different. We're not going to list your resentments. I want you to make a list of people you feel smugly superior to. And he got this look on his face like, oh, this is going to be a long list. But when I do This Was Our Course, I shatter that, because the forgiveness always must come from really deep-seated understanding. I got to get it that this person I hate is me. He's me. He's me on a really bad day, but he's me. That I ain't superior. That the illusion of separation of the ego is, oh, I would never do that, and then feel smugly superior. And Confucius had a great saying. Confucius said that the chains that bind us most closely are the ones we think we have broken. And so what happens is that I am hurt by people, and then I become the person that either hurts them, or I go so far the other way that I build a whole life of being the opposite just to validate my being right about them. Right? I sponsor a guy this is a great example. His father was a bad alcoholic and bailed out on him and his brothers and sisters when he was a little kid. And he got such a resentment towards his father, and he was determined never to be like that. Now, his brother has turned out just to be like that. His brother has abandoned a couple families, but he's going to be the opposite. He's going to be different. And he's in a marriage with 5 kids, with a wife that cheats on him. And he won't bail out of that marriage, and he's in hell because, damn it, he's not going to be like his father, even if it kills him. And I'm telling you, he's just as much a prisoner of that resentment as his brother is to be driven to go from one woman to another to another. They're both prisoners of the same thing. We're just opposite sides of the same coin. It's exactly the same. So I often think the things that Shakespeare said it best when he says, methinks he protests too much. Anything that I'm adamantly opposed to, I'm connected with. There is no separate. It's an illusion that I'm not like that. Well, the reason I'm saying I'm not like that is because I'm like that. Right? I just keep it in the shade. I was taking a guy through the steps years ago, and we got to This Was Our Course on a resentment, and it was about a third of the way through his resentment list, and he had the worst resentment came up, and it really should have been the one that was first. And from this guy, I learned to always try to get to the worst ones first to get them out of the way. But this was, we were into it a while. The resentment was towards his father. And this guy came from an alcoholic home, and his dad was a really bad drunk. Really bad. And I mean, to the kind of guy that he would get drunk and he'd beat this kid repeatedly, and the kid ended up in the emergency room on a couple occasions from the beatings his father would inflict on him when he's drunk. And other times his father would be hungover and just irritable, and he'd yell and scream, and he was almost as bad when he was hungover as he was when he was drunk. And then other times he'd come off a run and he'd feel so guilty and remorseful. He'd make all these grandiose promises. I'm going to get you a bicycle, and I'm going to take you to Disneyland and all that stuff. And he'd never follow through with any of it. And the kid's life was dominated by this, and he couldn't have friends over because he never knew what was going to be going on in his house. And he walked on eggshells his whole childhood. And he used to cower in his bedroom and sometimes hide under the bed. And this was a resentment that owned him. And it owned him for his whole life. And he went to therapy for a number of years. And he was funny, we used to laugh, he later laughed about it, because he also went to a Gestalt therapist. And he beat the pillows and he did the Gestalt chair. And where and you scream and you yell and you try to get all that stuff out, and nothing ever changed. And he spent a fortune in therapy trying to be free of it. And it never went away. And it affected his ability to work productively. He had this thing with bosses and authority, and he had this inability to have good relationships. It affected his ability. He was a totally alone guy. And we're getting to this part, and he starts telling me about his dad and everything that happened. And we looked at what was hurt, threatened, or affected, or interfered with. And it was everything. This owned him. It's the number one resentment in his life. He'd had it for decades. We start talking about this was our course. And I said we're reading it, and I'm telling the guy, I said, you have to realize how you're like your dad. And he flipped out at me. He started yelling at me. He started, I'm not like my father. My father was a selfish goddamn animal. He went on this tirade. I thought he was going to hit me. I just backed right. Whatever. And I'm sitting there I'm thinking to myself, I'm getting it. This guy is not prepared to look at this from an entirely different angle. This is really defended within him. So I backed off. I said, just go on to the next one. And he starts reading the next resentment. And I'm not even listening to him because something's going on inside of me. And what is going on inside of me is I'm getting this thing becoming clear to me. And I think what was happening next within me was as a result of a prayer I always say before I hear a fifth step. As I tell the guy that's going to tell the fifth step to ask God to be part of this, I always get quiet and ask God to help me to be useful. And what happened next was not of me, but it was through me. As my friend Bob says, I never am the well, but sometimes I get to be the pipe. And I stopped the guy, and it was an inspiration, and I'm not this smart, I'm telling you, I'm not this smart. And I said to the guy, I want to talk about something you covered earlier. And he says, you want to talk about my goddamn father? I said, no. I want to go back. Let's go back to the beginning. There was that relationship with those kids. Let's talk about that. He says, what of it? I said, I was just wondering if any time in that deal, in that relationship where those kids were there, if you ever did anything when you were drunk or stoned on drugs or hungover, that you might have ever done anything that might have hurt those kids. And he turned white. And he had this look on his face, and he put his head down, and when he lifted his head up, he had tears running down his face. And I'll never forget the voice, this choked whisper. And he says to me, this voice that was like from the depths of hell, he said, I'm just like my goddamn father. I said to him, how did you feel about yourself when you hurt those kids? He said, I couldn't stay drunk enough. I said, do you think you're any different from your dad? And he said, my dad is old now. I haven't seen him in a few years. And he's sick. And he's gotten to a point where his liver doesn't function and his pancreas is all screwed up. And he physically cannot drink. He cannot metabolize alcohol. His body's shutting down on him. And he's been forced into a state of abstinence from alcohol. Physically he can't metabolize it. And he's the most lonely, miserable person on the planet. Nobody in the family has anything to do with him. He's all alone. And I said to him, could you see how that could be like you? And he thought about it and he said, that is a vision of my future without Alcoholics Anonymous. And I got to watch this guy do what it says in this next part. And it says, in the next part, it says, referring to our list again, putting out of our minds the wrongs others had done, we resolutely looked for our own mistakes. And what the book's really asking me to do is, I'm not looking for my part here. That's something that you hear in AA. This is not my part. As a matter of fact, it's dangerous to even think about looking for my part. Because if you do that, there's the implication that they had their part too. The book says, disregarding the other person involved entirely, I look for my faults. So what my friend started doing is he had to look at what kind of a son he had been, not in the light of all the terrible things his father had done. Let's imagine let's not look at your father's bad behavior. Let's not hide your bad behavior behind his anymore. Let's look, what if your father was the perfect father? Then let's look at what kind of son you were. Let's look at this kind of son that you were in its own light and not hide it behind the wrongdoings of your dad. And when he did that, what he realized that even though his father had been out of line and been sick and awful and beat him and did all that stuff, he used every ounce of that to be the worst possible son he could have ever been. And he got up enough courage to go make the amends to his father. And I remember he told me about it. He said he went to this shabby little trailer where his father lived all by himself. And he knocked on the door and he said that he was expecting emotionally, it felt like this big monster was going to open the door. And it was this little old scared, shaking old man. This little old man who was dying of untreated alcoholism, who was wasting away. And he went in and he started to clear up his wreckage of the things he had done to his father, all the times he had bad-rapped his father and tried to turn people against him, all the things he had done to his father, the money he'd never returned, all the things he'd done his whole life, and he justified it all by his father's bad actions. And I've been a master of that in my life. I'm the kind of guy, if I worked for someone and I could find them doing something out of line, then I could steal from them and feel justified. If I was in a relationship and I could catch the girl I was with cheating on me one time, that was like go have free sex 10 times card, you know. It was like, right? It was like I spent a life of justifying all kinds of bad behavior by the wrongdoings of others. And for the first time in my life, Alcoholics Anonymous is asking me to stand up and take the responsibility. And stop hiding behind the wrongdoings of others. Bob, where was I at fault? This is my inventory. It's not the other person's. And this guy started making amends to his dad, and he took care of his dad until his dad died. And they became very close. And he became the only islands of sanity in a world for his father that was often very painful. And he'll tell you to this day that the greatest thing Alcoholics Anonymous gave him next to his sobriety was he got his daddy back. What a tremendous transformation if I'm willing to just change my outlook and change my perception and look at these things differently. There's a freeing thing that comes in here. And you know something, I spent in this thing about feeding the wrong dog, I spent years in therapy trying to free myself of guilt, but I was never willing to take other people off the hook. And the problem with that is when you unleash the dogs of judgment, they always come back and bite the master. So just as I judged you in the loneliness in the middle of the night, I would turn that stuff on me. And then I would beat myself up as harshly as I beat you up for being imperfect and not living up to the thing, my own high level of standards that I would judge you so harshly for not living up to. And then when I was alone with me, I would do the same thing to me that I did to you. And I wanted to be free of it from my end, but I was never willing to be free, to let you be free. I wouldn't take you off the hook for being imperfect, and yet I wanted the world to take me off the hook. And it's impossible. I am connected. I am part of you. That's why in the Lord's Prayer, it alludes to a process of forgiveness. It says, forgive us our trespasses. You want to be taken off the hook? You want to forgive yourself? You want to feel okay about yourself? Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. There's nowhere in this process where it tells us how to forgive ourselves. What it tells us, you forgive everybody else, you develop love and acceptance and compassion for them, and I'll tell you what's going to happen. You're going to get it for yourself. Cause and effect. You cannot do it the other way around. You cannot get it for yourself unless you first give it to others. It never happens that way. And I started to get free of a lot of this stuff. As I took them off the hook, an amazing thing happened. As I found I started having more compassion for me. And I beat myself up less for my shortcomings. And I became more okay with me, just as I became more okay with you. The Hindus have a story of creation that I really like a lot. It's a little different than the Judeo-Christian story of creation. And in the Hindu story of creation, it says that unlike ours, where it's God created the heaven and the earth and everything, God existed for endlessly by Himself and nothing. There was no universe. It was just God. That's all there was. And they call it Maya, the great illusion, because what happened is God just devised a cosmic game. And the cosmic game was He broke Himself up into an infinite number of parts. He gave all the parts amnesia. And the game was, which parts are going to realize that they're God? Which parts are going to realize that they're not separate? That it's an illusion that they're separate. Which parts are going to claim their inheritance? The Hindus call that enlightenment. Or we call it in Alcoholics Anonymous a spiritual awakening. When I awaken to the fact that I am you. And I'll tell you something. You get involved in Alcoholics Anonymous and you sponsor people and you start hearing fifth steps. What becomes clear after a while, it's the same guy. I have not heard a new fifth step yet. It's the same guy. Different cities, different equipment, different drug, but it's the same guy with the same feelings and the same fears. It's the same guy. That maybe what Einstein said was right, that the great illusion of mankind is that there's more than one of us here. If once I awaken that I am you, then as it says in the 12 by 12, it's pointless to get angry or be hurt by people who, like me, are suffering from the pains of growing up. We're all here. We're all the same. All that makes us different is the defense mechanisms and the facade and the illusions of the ego. That we're all the same person here. There's an old Indian story of an earthworm that was very territorial, and he staked out his plot of topsoil, and he would just burrow through this topsoil, and it was all he would feed on it, and it was all he lived on this topsoil, and he made sure no other earthworms intruded into his space. And he was an old, big earthworm, about this long. And one day he's going through the soil, and he comes up against this other earthworm. And I guess his earthworm's doing under the soil, they're posturing and they're getting ready for battle, and they're in their body language, they're both saying to each other, "Get out of here, this is my space." And the other guy says, "No, you get out of here, this is my space, this is my place." No, it's my place. And they're doing all that. They finally attack each other to realize that the guy has just attacked his own tail. That it's the same, he's the same guy. And I think that's what happens. That's why whenever I hurt you, or attacked you, in some level, somewhere, I always hurt me. There was no free lunch here. I may cover it up. I may pretend like I got away from it, but I got away with it. There was never a free lunch. Everything I've ever done to another human being, I paid a price for it. Every time I've bitten you, I've bitten me, without exception. And the Hindus call that karma. We say it in Alcoholics Anonymous, what comes around goes around. You know what the word karma translates into the English directly is the word doing. When something is my karma, it is my doing. I have made decisions based on self, which later placed me in that position to be hurt. It is my doing. I'm the guy, everything's turned to crap. That is my doing. I'm the guy who did this. I'm the guy who bit the end of the worm and realized that without knowing it, that I'm hurting you, but I ain't hurting you, I'm hurting me. It is my karma. It is my doing. So referring to our list, again, putting out of our minds the wrongs others had done, we resolutely looked for our own mistakes. Where had I been selfish? Where had I been dishonest? Where had I been self-seeking? And where had I been frightened? And if I've done what it says in This Was Our Course, and I can see myself in that person and I've taken them off the hook, then this is very easy. Because now I'm realizing that I've been retaliating and building this case against a guy that's sick and he's a lot like me. And the judgments is gone, and I start to get some of the understanding, as it talks about later in step 10, that our purpose is to grow in understanding and effectiveness. And this is where it begins, right here in this fourth step. Where for the first time in my life, I start to understand and see myself in other people. I start to see myself. And so I can answer these questions now because I'm not defended anymore. I don't have a case built against these people. Where was in this situation, where had I been selfish? Wasn't it really all about satisfying my needs and my protecting my stuff? Where had I been dishonest? Look at the case I built against this person. Look how wrong I had been. The exact nature of my wrongs is I realized how wrong I'd been in my judgments of these people. Where had I been self-seeking? It was all about me and my gratification and my validation and my security. And where had I been frightened? I was driven by these fears, and then once I make the judgments based on the fears, I'm driven to defend them because God forbid I would be wrong. And I would have to look like I was wrong. And I'd have to... Remember, there was I understand this inability or this resistance to admitting that I'm wrong. There was an old episode of Happy Days where the Fonz went through the whole show trying to say he was wrong and he couldn't get the words out. He'd go, I understand that. There's something about me. It's like I'm just about ready to tell I'm wrong, and then I'll want to explain it to you again how I'm not, you know. I'm the guy that stands before of a judge and says, guilty, Your Honor, but with an explanation. I want to explain it to you how I'm not really wrong. And this is the first time in my life that I ever stood up as a man, as a free man, and took the responsibility for all the problems in my life and all the separation and all the conflict. And know beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was me. That these cases I'd built against all these people weren't right. I am the guy that's been doing this. I'm the guy. The inventory, though a situation had not been entirely our fault, we tried to disregard the other person involved entirely. I think it's bad to... I didn't get this for a long time. I used to say this when I would talk to guys I sponsored and when I would do workshops. When we get to this last part referring to our list again, I would talk about looking for my part. And it started to bother me when I would say that. And I'd hear other people in AA say it. We're looking for our part. And then I'm with a guy one time that I'm sponsoring, and we're going through this, and I got it. Because by saying looking for my part, I'm keeping the door open to thinking that they have a part too. And it's a dangerous position for me to take. Because if I take that position, I'll do like this guy I know. I'll go to make the amends. And after I'm done the amends, I'll stand there and wait. Because I took care of my part and... I mean, I've been so humble here, really. And the book says we can't do that. We got to disregard the other person involved entirely. Where was I to blame? The inventory was mine, not the other person's. When I saw my faults, I listed them. I placed them before me in black and white. I admitted my wrongs honestly and were willing to set these matters straight. This is an amazing thing. Isn't this weird? You know, we start making this resentment list. These are the people that really owe us amends. And you get through the backside of the process and you realize, oh my God, I owe them amends. I am the source of the separation here. I have to go mend this separation that I created out of my self-will between me and this person, disregarding what they did entirely. I can't hide behind it anymore. And what I find out is everyone I ever secretly thought owed me an amends, I actually owed them one. I mean, they wouldn't tell you that up front. You'd never write the inventory. I mean, you never would. If your sponsor said to you in the beginning, we're going to make this list of all the people you hate that have really hurt you, and we're going to do it so you will make amends to them, you'd go, what, are you out of your mind? But if you do this process and you have the change of consciousness that it talks about, and this was our course, you will want to make it right with God's help. With God's help. You will want peace. Notice that the word fear is bracketed alongside the difficulties with Mr. Brown, Mrs. Jones, and the employer. I'm going to talk about this for a couple minutes, and we'll break for lunch, and then we'll finish fear and sex after lunch. Right in this room, we'll have fear and we'll have sex. Well, Jim H. is going to bring some anatomically correct Barbie and Ken dolls, and we're going to really get into that. When I did my first real inventory between 4 and 5 years, now you got to understand, I'm pretty entrenched in AA. I'm going to 12 meetings a week. Probably I'm sponsoring guys. I have commitments, but I'd never really done this. I'd done the life story version. So I get through the resentment part, and I did really a great job. I followed this book precisely. And I'm sitting at the kitchen table, and I got a legal pad, and I wrote fears across the top of the page, and I'm going to do the fear inventory. And I'm sitting there, and I tell you, I cannot think of anything I'm afraid of. I'm drawing a blank. And it's not that I knew that I'd had fears. I mean, when I got sober, I was afraid of going to prison. I was afraid of being homeless. I was afraid of stuff catching up with me from my past. A lot of stuff. I was afraid of drinking. But a lot of those fears seemed to be put to rest. Seemed to be. And so I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, well, maybe I don't have any fears. I'm sober over 4 years. Well, maybe just AA works and I just don't have any fears. And we have a monthly speaker meeting where they bring in out-of-town speakers, and I went to that meeting that night, and I'm listening in the meeting, and after the meeting I'm going up and talking to this guy from out of town, and I'm telling him, I'm doing another inventory, and this time I'm really following the book, and they finished the resentment part, and I'm getting to the fear section, and I'm drawing a blank, and I said, I don't think I have any fears now that I'm in AA a few years. I think I don't have any. And he said, really? And I said, yeah, I don't have any fears. He said, do you mind if I ask you some questions? I said, no, go ahead. He said, are you afraid of large, angry, barking dogs? Well, yeah, but we're not talking about everybody. Are you afraid of large, angry, barking dogs? Well, yeah, but are you? Yes, okay, you put that down. Are you afraid of rattlesnakes? Well, yeah, but everybody, but are you? Yes, I am. Okay, put that down. Black widow spiders. Yes, I'm afraid of black widow spiders. Are you afraid of being embarrassed? Yeah. Are you afraid of what people think of you? Yeah. Are you afraid of dying old and alone? Yeah. Are you afraid no one will ever love you? Yeah. Are you afraid of women? Yeah. Are you afraid of homosexuality? Oh God, I spent time in county jails with my back up against the wall looking at people. Don't look at me, I'm afraid of that. Are you afraid of retribution and stuff catching up with you from amends you've never made? Yeah. Are you afraid of getting sick and not being able to take care of yourself? Yeah. Are you afraid of certain things other people about you that you don't want anybody to find out? Are you afraid they'll find out? Yeah. And he goes on and on. He finally says, so, is there anything you're not afraid of? I thought, how the hell did that happen? And this book kind of touches on it. It says this short word, fear, somehow touches every aspect of our lives. It's an evil and corroding thread. The fabric of my existence is shot through with it. When it said earlier in the chapter that I'm driven by 100 forms of fear, it is so part of my nature that I don't get it that I'm afraid. I'm sitting at that table looking for fear and I don't come up with anything because I'm like a fish looking for water. It is the driving force in my life. It drives me to work where I work, to act the way I act, to think and judge the way. All my judgments come from my fears. or the things I need to protect, the things that I believe my fears much more than I've ever believed in God's grace. I'm dominated by my fears. And Silkworth says something that I think I've taken to heart throughout my whole recovery. And I don't know if he's talking about, I think he's referring to us when we're drinking, but I'll tell you, this is just as much true. When Silkworth says, for the alcoholic, his alcoholic life seems the only normal one, is that even well into my sobriety, I can be sick, and I just adjust to being sick. I think that it's normal to be full of anxiety. I think it's normal to worry all the time. I think it's normal to wake up and my head's already telling me what they're going to do today. And, oh man, you better watch out for this. I think that's normal. I think God said, we're going to create people, and we're going to give them 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, a heart, lungs, and let's make them all neurotic. That's not normal to be neurotic. It's not normal to be consumed with fear and worry. It's not normal to go through life trying to clear up the wreckage of your future. I mean, that's not normal. But I adjust to it. I think it's normal. Shot through with it, the fabric of my existence. Chuck Chamberlain went through a phase. We'd get to the podium and he'd look out at the audience and he'd rub his hands together and he'd say, what controls you? What drives you? Right now. What drives you? He used to give me the creeps. He'd look right at me. He did those laser-like eyes. He'd say, what drives you? I'd sit there and go, oh, because I was driven. I'm just, right as he's saying that, I'm being driven by, hope other people don't realize he's looking at me, you know. Right? I'm driven by all these fears. What do you think of me? How do I look? Do you like me? How can I change it? Isn't it all about me? Self-centered fear. Bill in the 12 by 12 says that self-centered fear was the chief activator of all our character defects. And notice in resentments, there's not a resentment that exists that doesn't have fear involved with it. Because when I ask myself the question, what was threatened? There's something threatened in every resentment. Whether it's my ambition, me getting my own way, or my pocketbook, or my pride, or my security. Something is threatened in every resentment. So fear will pop up again in the sex inventory. It is the dominating, driving force in a guy's life like mine. I heard a speaker say years ago, and I thought about it, and I thought he's absolutely right. I didn't at first, I didn't get it. He said there were 2 dominant forces in human nature, fear and love. I'm either motivated by fear in all its forms, guilt, shame, anxiety, worry, resentments, in all its forms, or I'm motivated by love and a concern for others. And one is a very self-involved existence, and the other one is a very other-centered existence. One is very self-reliant, and the other one is very God-reliant. One is very locked up, and one is very free. And I think Alcoholics Anonymous is a process of shifting my life from a life of self-centeredness, self-reliance, self-concern, driven by fear, to a life of other-centeredness, God-reliant, and a life driven by love and service. And that's the shift that I'm trying to make in Alcoholics Anonymous. But you can't make that shift once and for all. That's why we have steps 10 and 11. Because I can shift over here and I can be the most... But it's almost as if my consciousness has a spring on it. That left unattended, I always revert back to worrying about me and wrapped up in me and protecting me. So it's vigilance of pulling myself back over to the light. Because it's my natural inclination is the darkness, is the isolation, is being up in here, running the universe, playing God, full of fear. So I must constantly be taking actions in this thing, because the spiritual malady is a chronic illness, just like diabetes. It's constant maintenance. And in step 4 is where we move out the big blockages so that we can stand in the sunlight, probably temporarily, because we always are drawn back into the darkness. If nothing else, it's horrible, but it's familiar. Why don't we break for lunch? I'm Bob Darrell, I'm an alcoholic. I am the place where God shines through. Him and I are one, not two. I need not worry, fret, or plan. He wants me where and as I am. And if I be relaxed and free, He'll carry out His plan through me. Amen. Well, I'm afraid we're still on fears. Page 68. We talked about the little introduction to fears, and on the top of page 68 it tells us exactly what to do. It says, but there's a line right before the instructions. It says, it's set in motion, fears, it's set in motion trains of circumstances which brought us misfortune we felt we didn't deserve, but did not we ourselves set the ball rolling. What's that mean? I'll tell you what my experience is with that. It's what the psychologists and psychiatrists call self-fulfilling prophecies. In other words, I get a fear, and that fear sets in motion trains of circumstances which bring me about more misery and more discomfort and more problems in my life. In early sobriety, I heard a guy say something that was so right on the money and profound that I never forgot it. He said, I've never had a problem in my life that has caused me more trouble than my solutions to my problems. So what does this mean, this self-fulfilling prophecy, this how our fears set in motion trains of circumstances which brought us more misfortune? What happens is I become afraid. I make a judgment. Fears are judgments. And I make this judgment that something awful could happen here, or this could be bad. And then I start acting on the fear, on the judgment that this could be awful. And what happens is I make the fear come true. I'll give you a couple examples. Early sobriety. I get into my first sober relationship. I don't have much self-esteem. I think I do, but I don't. And I'm full of a lot of anxiety. And I'm in this relationship, and I am afraid, and what the fear is and the judgment is that she's not going to stay with a guy like me. She's going to reject me. That's the fear. So what happens is I start acting on the fear to try to protect myself from the fear. And the fear drives me to become so possessive and so smothering that I eventually become the nutcase that drives by her apartment in the middle of the night to make sure there's no guy's cars there. I become the guy that watches her all the time. And if she hugs some guy in the meeting, hey, what are you doing there? And who are you talking to? And I become the guy that's always looking at her. I become the guy that eventually makes it so hard for her to be around me that I literally drive her out of my life. And I make the fear come true. And I remember the day that she dumped me and went. She couldn't take it anymore. She used to say things to me like, you're always looking at me. I feel like you're smothering me. And I couldn't get it. I didn't get it. And then the day that she broke up with me, there was a little voice in the back of my head that said, see, you were right. I like being right. Even though I'm depressed and miserable and alone, at least I'm right. Because that was the beginning. The beginning was the judgment. She's going to leave me. And I said, set in motion trains of circumstances which made it come true. Many years before I got sober, the last time my father ever really tried to go to bat for me and help me, I got dry for a period of a couple months, and I was trying to put my life back together. I just trashed it one more time, and he had a friend who owned a engineering outfit, an environmental engineering outfit, and this was back in the days when environmental engineering was cutting edge stuff. And he went to his friend who owned this company, and the guy gave me a job. And it was a tremendous opportunity for me. He was willing to send me to school to teach me this. And this was when water pollution and air pollution was a big deal back then. And he was one of the few companies on the ground floor. And so I had this tremendous opportunity to go to actually have a career. And it would have been very lucrative. It would have been a great deal for a guy like me. But I tell you, I went to this job afraid. And here's my judgment or my fear. My judgment is, and my fear is, that the people that work there are going to look at me and think to themselves, the only reason he's here is that his dad's friends with the guy who owns the company. Otherwise, we wouldn't have somebody like him here. My fear is that they're not going to accept me and they're going to reject me. So what happened is that fear drove at me till I became the guy that was so defensive and so on edge and so uptight at work that after several months they're calling me